So as things continue to spiral out of control, I think a question we're all asking ourselves is, where is this going to go? How is this going to wind up? What's going to be the end result of the protests, of the radical social and cultural changes that America, and to a lesser extent the rest of the West, are undergoing? And I think it's a very difficult question, and there's a lot of different opinions I'm seeing. Some people think we're going to have a Spanish Civil War scenario where we're going to have some reactionary figure who comes in, restores order, and deals with the communists. Other people think we're going to go down the Chinese Cambodian path where the radicals completely win and they implement their policies utterly unopposed, and it just goes as far as it feasibly can. There's lots of other in between these options that things just kind of go completely back to normal. This is just kind of a flash in a pan. It's nothing to really get worried about. That this whole thing is just being used by the more moderate Democratic establishment as a way of beating Trump. So, what's going to happen? I think there's three major possibilities, and I'm going to go through them in order of the of the least possible to the most possible. And for a lot of this, I'm going to be focusing on talking about examples of where this is happening and happened historically. Because what exactly the breakdown in the United States will look like is very much up in the air. If the country was to split apart, would it be on like a rural urban divide? Would it be on a racial divide? Would it be on a partisan state divide? Would it be regional? We don't really know. So I'm just going to speak in kind of more general terms. So the least likely option is what I'm going to call a dissolved state. So under this, while there might nominally remain some sort of rump state or something that makes a pretense of a federal government, it doesn't effectively control the country anymore. So there's a couple different ways that this can come about. You could have a case like Somalia where there just wasn't anything that could even really be considered a federal government for a prolonged piece of time, and it was literally just a bunch of warlords backed by various foreign powers fighting each other. That's also what happened in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the country basically ceased to exist and just became colonies and mini satellite states of all the other African countries. Some other countries that are kind of in this model would be something like Syria. Now, Syria's kind of changed, and it looks like Assad's basically won at this point. But for a long time, like at the start of the Syrian civil war, you had the Syrian government, you had the opposition, you had ISIS, you had the Kurds, you had all these different factions, and the Syrian government was no longer clearly in charge of the country. And you just had mass violence and no real pretense of law and order or centralized control. Other countries I'd put in this category is Iraq. At the moment, it's not as bad, but during the various Iraqi civil wars, like you have Kurdistan, which is basically broken off. The Sunnis and Shias, I generally don't acknowledge each other as being legitimate. So you have kind of a country with three completely different ethno-religious groups who don't like each other at all. So it's basically the state de facto doesn't exist. Either it's a puppet of the Sunni Arabs or the Shia Arabs, or it just has no power whatsoever. Other models for kind of this is the Soviet collapse, where the state just kind of falls apart. I guess like Russia is considered to be the main successor, the legal successor to the Soviet Union, but it basically just dissolved into its composite parts. Yugoslavia is another case. Obviously, Serbia kept the title, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, but it effectively didn't govern most of Yugoslavia towards the end. So, what would that look like in America? That would be maybe the federal government would continue to exist in some form, but you might have states seceding. You might have the army pretty much dissolve itself. Maybe kind of almost like a civil war type scenario where you have the local national guards going over to their governor's authority, or just kind of a mass desertion of military units that go over to their respective states or political alliances. You could also have regional organizations like the Northwest or the Mountain States or the South or that sort of thing, or you could have racial or political divides. So it's kind of hard to say exactly what the fault lines would be, but basically the scenario would be that the Central American government more or less ceases to de facto exist, and it just kind of becomes a free for all of different factions, both on a local and a national level. So that's model one. I think that's the least likely to happen, but that's a possibility. Number two is what I call the failed state. Now, the failed state in this context is, I don't know, I'm kind of using it to be a bit like case one, but not quite as bad. So I'm defining this as a case where there is a clear central government and there's not really a plausible replacement for the central government. And even if there are secessionist movements, they aren't particularly large. Like they might just be a small portion of the country, but there's not really an impending overthrow of the government coming. So there is a central government. It does exist, but it's so weak and corrupt, and it doesn't effectively exercise more than nominal power outside of the capital and maybe the core region. So some examples of this I came up with were the Republic of China during the 30s and 40s. After the Northern Expedition, China was technically united under the KMT, and the warlords held at least nominal allegiance to the Chiang Kai-shek's government, and they were able to recruit quite large armies and levy a fair amount of China's resources. But the on paper numbers kind of belie the reality that a lot of it was like local militias, and they had to like pay local warlords and like give them like authority and stuff in order to kind of cobble that together. So on paper during World War II, the Republic of China was the internationally and nationally recognized government of China. The communists, for most of the war, were too weak to be a real threat to their control of the entire country. And no one took the reorganized national government puppet state seriously, not even the Japanese. So that's kind of a case like that. Mexico, I think, is another case like that, particularly under the National Action Party. For those of you who don't know, so Mexico, basically the institutional revolutionary party who governed Mexico for most of the night from the Mexican Revolution to like the 1990s, I think, is when Vicente Fox, or maybe the early 2000s, one of the two. But they had a deal with the drug cartels where they left them alone, and the drug cartels kept their violence to an acceptable degree and paid off officials. So Mexico was a narco state, but it was less violent than say Colombia. Because like what happened in Colombia was the government was never particularly corrupt and was almost always actively fighting the cartels and guerrilla groups. So Colombia was a lot more violent, but that's not really, I would argue, due to government corruption. It was due to the government being less corrupt and unwilling to get pushed around. And whereas Mexico kind of just embraced becoming a narco state. So when Pan came to power, because they were a conservative Christian party, they said we aren't going to take bribes from the cartels anymore. We're going to start enforcing the national laws. And the cartels basically, it was kind of like a let my hombres go scenario. Let La Raza go. So like basically the cartels said, okay, if you're going to come down on us, we're going to come down on the whole country. And that's what the drug war came from. And there was just an orgy of violence that overtook Mexico for the better part of a decade. I mean, it's still going on, but what happened is you had the PRI won re-election, and now you have whatever the left-wing nationalist party is. And they're a lot more soft on the cartels, so they toned the violence down a lot. But during that time period, you had judges getting assassinated, you had soldiers getting attacked, you had police getting attacked, the kind of the government control of the country was kind of theoretical. And this often happens during Mexico's history just because of the way Mexico's geography works out and kind of the diversity of the country. And then obviously you have like the Zapatistas in the south, which basically have like whatever the Yucatan Mexico is like semi-independent at this point in time. In Colombia, you had a situation where the government didn't control large portions of the country as they were controlled by FARC, and you also had the right wing death squads, the auto self defense forces or whatever they were called, that controlled other parts of the country, and then you had the cartels, which also controlled parts of the country. Colombia, the actual government didn't really have that much power. It was kind of the definition of a failed state. Some other examples I came up with. This one was a little more difficult. It's just a lot of Brazil is a bit like that today, where the corruption and crime and lack of effective infrastructure or central control basically means there's like not a lot they can nationally do to deal with a lot of things. Like I think that's part of the reason Bolsonaro opted to not have a lockdown or any kind of quarantine is Brazil's completely incapable of doing that. So he figured it would do more harm than good to try to shut down Brazil's economy. Like I said, it's a bit more difficult to kind of describe this. Maybe another example this might be Russia in the early 90s when you just had a total breakdown of all the social welfare systems and you just had kleptocrats that grabbed everything, and kind of the idea of a federal government was just kind of a nominal notion at best. So I think this is somewhat likely. So what would probably happen under this scenario is most of the states would and cities would defund, or not most of them, but a lot of them would defund or uh, dismantle their police departments. And they might actually do this at the federal level, or the federal government would do that, or just defund it in favor of more money on social programs and defund the military, and just in general kind of pursue a strategy of not prosecuting federal crimes. And basically the in many of the state governments, the municipal governments, and the national government would either become so corrupt, just crippled from the number of restrictions placed on them. Like what we're seeing is police are just walking off the job. Like they're just refusing to do their job. And because of the rules of engagement, where basically they can't shoot people who are trying to kill them, I think you're going to see more and more of them just kind of throw down their weapons and walk off the job. And you'll probably see this in other government ministries. They like part of the scenario that the federal government might undergo a purge where they just start removing all the white people and replacing them with like just like random people who can't really do anything. And just I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. It's a little bit difficult to describe a failed state that hasn't totally fallen apart. Probably another example would be something like Pakistan, where I don't think there's a real chance of the Islamists overthrowing the Pakistani government. But I've also heard that the Pakistani government's authority outside of Islamabad in the major cities is very theoretical. And you have things like the ISI, I think it's called, like their secret, their intelligence service is like completely not controlled by the state and just randomly attacks India whenever it feels like it, trying to nig them into a war. So I would say that's option two, and that's somewhat likely. Option three, and this is the one that I think is most likely to happen, is also kind of difficult to describe. So under this scenario, things would just keep getting worse and worse and worse, and the US would just kind of keep descending into anarchy. And eventually, I don't want to use the term moderate because they wouldn't be moderate, they'd be just as extreme, but somewhat more practical or somewhat more pragmatic faction of the Black Lives Matter, or just the core Democratic Party, will manage to gain power and they'll probably conduct at least limited purges of the. Once again, it's not really based on ideology. It's not necessarily they're going to purge the most like the furthest left people, but just the people who aren't willing to play ball and kind of establish something vaguely resembling order. I think anarcho-tyranny is kind of a way to describe it. So, what would happen under such a state and kind of a government? Maybe it's easier just to list a kind of a couple governments. Is you'd have a left wing populist government that would maintain all the rhetoric of Black Lives Matter and Antifa and would arbitrarily carry out policies largely in line with that, such as just massively increasing affirmative action. They might implement reparations. They might just start expropriating white people's property. But it's relatively stable compared to the first two options. There's not really a. It doesn't look like there's immediate chance of the regime being overthrown, despite how bad things have kind of gotten. And a couple examples I have for this is Venezuela, where it looked like it was going to collapse for a while, but it looks like it's kind of plugging along. And even if it's not the case at the moment, it's been the case. So, like, what happened with Venezuela is Chavez came to power as a left wing nationalist, a left wing populist, and he kept all like the rhetoric, like the nationalism, the we hate the United States, the like socialism, the state control of the economy, that kind of thing. But on a more practical level, the state is just run as a kleptocracy. Like it's more about the party and what's good for the party than what's good than fulfilling the particular ideological interests, if that makes sense. That's not to say they don't have a far left ideology, not to say they don't pursue those policies, but the policies. So what I mean is, it's more than just cynicism. They're like true believers, but the highest loyalty is to the spoils system and to keep things running just well enough that they can continue looting the state. And that's kind of how I see Venezuela, where the government's goal is just to keep things limping along long enough that they can steal as much as possible. South Africa is also a very good example of that. I don't think there's any reasonable chance of the ANC being overthrown or removed from power anytime soon. I think if they ever did lose elections, they wouldn't accept the results and they just dissolve the government or something, or they'd pull some shenanigans and hold new elections. I don't know if the ballots are rigged in South Africa. I would lean towards them not being rigged, and just because you have a such a strongly populist government that tells the masses whatever they want to hear, they kind of just continue to win re-election on that grounds. And just because it's gone from being a state with a party to a party with a state, I think is also kind of what would happen under this model. So, like in the case of South Africa, they didn't kill all the white people overnight. They're gradually stealing their land and gradually executing them because they know they're very economically important. And it feels to me like what they're trying to do is just keep the system running as long as possible, like just limping along so the party officials can keep enriching themselves and the government things don't get bad enough that the government actually gets removed from power. And that's kind of the situation they like. Another kind of example of that I would kind of say is India back when it was a one party state, basically under the INC. Because the INC implemented what's generally considered, if you actually look into it, to be the most strict affirmative action policies on earth. India has extremely complex caste based affirmative action, and it's really brutal, like more so than in Western countries. And you had that, and then you had like the rhetoric about self sufficiency, and not just self sufficiency, but like Gandhian local level socialism and all that kind of stuff. And they did implement these policies, and they were a disaster. But the goal is more, I think, than any particular commitment to socialism or to equality in India was maintaining the spoils system for the INC as long as possible and keeping themselves in a position where they could kind of keep looting the state and could just have the Gandhi family dominate it. So in America, what I could see happening is the Democrats succeed in dismantling most police departments or reforming them. So they go from being kind of a professional, somewhat arm's length um, state apparatus that is political, but isn't like openly political in the same way that like the brown shirts would be or the Red Guard were in China. And they replace the police with paramilitaries that are more like ideologically explicitly loyal to a reformed, more radical Democratic Party. And they kind of start to behave. I mean, we kind of have this complaint now, but we remove any pretense of professionalism and code of ethics, and they basically just become political commissars. They replace the local uh, police forces with that, and the army just kind of goes in that direction where they do another purge of the officer corps to really try to get as many flunkies and stooges in positions of power as they can. And the cities kind of just become even more like what they are now, where the Democrats basically at this point will they'll do amnesty. They'll pass probably some other laws to make voter fraud easier. Because keep in mind, America, I think, might be the only one of the only countries on Earth, at least in the developed world, where there are no voter ID laws, and they don't allow them to remove dead people from the voter rolls. So they'll probably just pass a lot more stuff like that, and either they'll give illegal immigrants amnesty, or they'll basically de facto allow them to vote. So even if the demographic changes don't make it so they can never that the Republicans can't win another election, they'll use some sort of voter fraud to make sure that they can. And they might do something like impeaching the theoretically conservative members of the Supreme Court, or just forcing them into retirement, or just packing the court by adding a bunch more justices. And America will just become a one party state where you'll have Democratic politicians come to power, or Democratic socialists, or whatever the form the Democratic Party takes. And they will come to power on a platform of just robbing, the white population, or just any of the like wealthy, successful population in America, and kind of giving it to the lumpen proletariat. And they will maintain their paramilitaries. They will maintain basically tyrannical control of the country, but it will be incredibly corrupt, incredibly poorly run, and it won't actually enforce any kind of order beyond what's good for the party. Like I said, it'll become a party with a state. And that's not always necessarily a bad thing, but in this case, it will be a bad thing. So, those are, I think, the three most likely outcomes: a dissolved state, a failed state, or an anarcho-tyranny state. None of them are particularly good. I guess from our standpoint, probably dissolved state is the best. The failed state, there might actually be some wiggle room in there as well if the individual states just become very autonomous and they're able to kind of implement their own policies, maybe implement border controls. But none of it looks good. I know some people wanted me to put in like a gamers will rise up thing, and we'll have like the Republicans will get together, or we'll have a third party that'll come in and save us, but I don't think that's going to happen at this point in time. So those are my thoughts. I hope you found that interesting.